Okay.
Great, thanks. Seth is here. Seth, we need to see you again in person. It's been too long.
Well, you're having virtual events. It's hard to see you in person.
We got to start having them again soon, I'm hoping. We'll see. There he is.
Yeah, this is as close to in person as we get.
Where are you, Seth?
I'm in my basement.
Yeah, but whereabouts?
Oh, I am. It's south, basically Indian Trail area, except for I'm only like a block and a half from Francis. So
Nice.
Cool. Is anyone here for the first time?
I am.
Ooh, John.
I am.
Nice.
I'm pretty
Well,
sure I am too.
You were here last time.
I thought that was, it might have been .NET.
Well, we're going to get started in just a minute. We start right at 6. We will go no later than 8. Oftentimes we end early, or we'll end early enough to have questions, but we always stop at 8. We tend to record them and post them to Intellitek's YouTube, and we'll add more info about that in the chat on that. So if there's nothing else, I might just wait just another minute and get started. Okay, well, my computer says 6, so I'll get started on my intro, and we'll see. I'm sure people will be joining in as we go. Nicole, can you just monitor the Meetup chat just in case on that?
Yes, yeah, I have it open right now.
Oh, sweet. Thanks. Okay. Well, welcome to the Spokane.net users group. I'm Erin, and I'm one of your moderators here. Hopefully you're in the right place. This is Building Modern Tools with System.command line with Kevin Bost and John, is it Sakura? Am I saying that right?
Sakura.
Sakura, sorry. John Sakura.
Or Sakura if you're a Portuguese speaker.
Oh, well, I'm not.
I'm not.
John and Kevin here, and Mark is going to introduce them in just a minute. We are the Spokane.net users group. It's sponsored by Intellitek. Intellitek is a software company located in Spokane, Washington. We do solution architecture, software design, and different kind of software leadership projects throughout the country. And we are actively hiring senior software developers. You are welcome to apply or find out more information at intellitek.com. And if you're joining us and your company is hiring, we would really love it if you would put a link in the comments of the chat so that we can spread the word about different positions in the area or even across the country. And these meetings are held the second Tuesday of every month. We might skip a month in August or so, but pretty much consistently on that. It's on on .NET and related topics. You can find a lot of our past groups within Meetup.com under the past meetups, or you can go to Intellitek's YouTube page for previous videos. You can sign up here. We'll also put that in the chat. Our next meetup in May is REST, Rex, and Microservices by Jeff Doolittle. He is a speaker outside of our meetup that I believe Mark and Kevin met at a meetup in Portland. And he'll be talking about what REST is, what microservices are, how they connect, and all those recs along the way. And there's more information on that on the Meetup page. We have a sister Meetup group, the Spokane DevOps group. They meet the third Thursday of every other month, and their next meetup is on May 20th. We'll be getting more information out on that soon. So if you're not connected on that meetup page, I would recommend joining that through the comments as well. Nicole posts that. We also have a survey going around to see if people wanted to maybe change times or topics or things like that. If you're at all interested in DevOps, but it hasn't worked with your schedule in the past, please fill out that survey that Nicole posted in the comments, and we can get back to you on that. And again, that lovely chat box I've been mentioning, please put your questions there, or feel free to interrupt and speak up and announce them when you have them. Kevin and John would love to answer those, as many as they can, all along the way. Again, share if you're hiring. If you have future topic ideas that you would like to have spoken about, or that you would like to talk about, please put that in the chat box as well. And I will add one more thing. If you enjoy coming to these meetups, but this time is a rough time for you, just throw in the chat box what time works best, because we're trying to figure out if we're meeting at the best time. And for now, let me introduce Mark Michaelis. He is kind of the founder of our .NET Meetup, and he will be introducing our speakers for tonight. Mark?
Thanks, Erin. So today I want to introduce John and Kevin, and I'm going to say two separate things. Number one, I met John, I think 3 years ago, John, at the MVP Summit. And I went up to John and I said, hey, I'm really excited about the system.command line. And I see that you're doing something, but I'd
Mark, I think we lost your audio.
I think we lost you.
Well, that's not good. What can I do? Hold on one
There
second.
you are. We got you now.
Don't twitch.
Okay.
I
didn't do anything intentionally. Anyway, so John and I met about 3 years ago, and by then he had already made a good start on the command line, but it was another one of about 5 or 6 command line parsers that Microsoft was coming out with. And my ask for John was that he could sort of make this the one command line to rule them all. And through a remarkable effort through him and sort of the people that he's been able to get to help him out, which includes Kevin, he's been able to listen really well to requirements and gather sort of input from so many people. And if you get to work with either Kevin or John, there's some characteristics that are truly remarkable about them. John is a very soft-spoken, very quiet sort of. He brings peace, but he's just such an intense listener and able to hear requirements and able to translate those requirements into an API and a model that is quite exceptional. And hopefully you'll see that as he talks about system.command line. But he was sort of the original visionary for what has now become system.command line. Originally was called something else. And then a few months after that, Kevin got involved. They actually were introduced at a hackathon to work on system.command line. And both of these people are people you want to pair with. If you get a chance to sort of pair with exceptional programmers, they both are able to help you and grow your skills because you get to pair with the likes of them. And so I want to introduce them as true experts in the field and people who have been foundational in making system.command line what it is. And hopefully, I think as you'll see, as they sort of share with you how easy it is and yet the complex stuff that it can do, you'll see people that can program and make complex things simple. So that's Kevin and John.
Thanks, Mark. Go ahead and take it away, Kevin and John.
Excellent. I'm going to grab screen share real quick as soon as I figure out how to work Teams, which is harder than it sounds. Okay. That should be John and I. And aside from the fact that Teams insists on minimizing itself every single time I use it, we should be off to the races. Thank you, Mark. Welcome, John. Just real quick to confirm, I trust people are seeing a screen that looks something like GitHub with both mine and John's face on it, give or take. So John and I wanted to go through, like Mark said, this has been a project that's been in the work for kind of a very long time. And I guess, John, do you want to give a little bit more background on kind of where it came from, since you were there from the beginning?
Sure. Yeah, I joined the the .NET CLI team about, I guess it was probably about 3 years ago or a little bit more before I met Mark. And one of the things that I was doing on that team was to try to wrangle some better test coverage, because the way that the .NET CLI at the time was tested very heavily relied on integration testing. And so the test loop was really long, and we had all these projects that would sit on disk, and the only way to test whether you could build a given project or test a given project type, right? They might, these are .NET project, CS project, FS project, things like this, VB projects, right? Was to run the entire build for each test. And so some of those tests were really just intending to test the command line parsing itself. At the time, the .NET CLI had 2 different command line parsers in its own code base, and there were probably 5 or 6 more command line parsers in our neighborhood. There were also a proliferation of open source command line parsers that weren't created at Microsoft. And they were all trying to solve some pretty similar problems. The problem that I set out to solve was really to, in the initial version of what eventually became System Command Line, was to make things more testable at the parser level, to just split parsing and invocation into separate pieces, and to have a parse model that you could just throw some strings at it, like you might want to in your test, and get back results and kind of look at them. And you can think of it as being analogous to, in terms of that pattern, a little bit analogous to the way Roslyn treats compilations, right? In Roslyn, you're not just compiling code so you can execute it. You can also compile code so that you can analyze it and build other kinds of more sophisticated tooling on top of it. And so we kind of took a hint from them. And one of the things that we were able to do was provide command line completions, where the parser actually knew how to do the completions for your application rather than having to write a different script for it. We'll talk about that in more detail. So anyway, that went into the .NET CLI version 2, I think. And then when Kathleen Dollard became the PM for the .NET CLI, she was leading an effort, which is the .NET Global Tools effort. And she said, what are we going to tell people that they should use for parsers? And we said, well, there's a lot of different parsers out there, but we've got this one here. And if we want to have a consistency of experience, right? And that consistency of experience is not just necessarily for developers, because developers have, we all have our own tastes and what kinds of tools we want, what kind of APIs we want. But the real goal that we kind of set for ourselves here, and we use that code base from the .NET CLI parser to become System Command Line. One of the goals there was really around end user experience, and a focus on a consistent end user experience, and also to start to modernize what the command line tooling world would look like in .NET, because it was still, main with a bunch of string args, and still had this legacy that was very much a Windows only kind of legacy. And we wanted to be able to adapt to both, Windows and sort of, Mac and Linux kinds of applications where the POSIX conventions were more common. And so it became this effort to try to, in a way, accommodate a lot of different scenarios, which is part of why it's been a very long journey, like Mark and Kevin have both mentioned.
Yeah, and I remember a lot of discussions that we ended up having around, how do we do this? Well, it works this way in Bash, it works this way in PowerShell. How do you actually kind of blend all of those worlds while trying to keep everyone happy, and not just offend everybody while finding a least common denominator solution. So for people who haven't found it, I'm going to drop the link to the repository in the chat for anybody who's interested in doing it. And one thing I will mention here too is you'll see that the NuGet links and whatnot of this thing still being in beta. It hasn't quite hit a GA release, but I don't want that to scare you away. Currently, it's only in beta because there are potentially breaking API changes coming down the pipe. And so it's sort of as we're figuring out what things should look like and how they should work. But rest assured, there's actually been quite a few things that have been built on top of this. So don't take beta as that there's not a commitment to this thing actually going out and going GA. For anybody who watched Microsoft Ignite, they showed off the brand new command line tool for upgrading your projects to .NET 5 or .NET 6, I guess, depending on where you're aiming. That tool there, if you pull open its source code, is actually built using this system command line. So this is quickly starting to become, as Mark put it at the beginning, that one command line to rule them all, or at least a reasonable standardization that people can start building from. So if
I could add one thing to that, in .NET 6 system command line has finally come home. And so then this code is already merged. It's in there in .NET 6. The .NET CLI itself also uses system command line.
Yeah. So if that gives you any confidence, the .NET CLI is using it in the latest version. So if you've pulled down any preview builds of the .NET CLI SDKs, when you run .NET on the command line, you're using this library. So if there's any questions about, is this going away? Not likely. it will evolve and move forward, but it isn't going backwards. I see one question in there. Is this a .NET 5 plus library? No. So it actually has, and John, you might be able to answer this better than me. Backwards compatible to what? I want to say Net Standard 2.0, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, so it targets Net Standard 2.0, which means you can run it on any version of .NET Core from 2.0 or 2.1 onward.
Yeah, and I believe
it
that's
also means you can
Framework 2.8 or Network Framework 4.8, if I'm not mistaken.
I think it's 4.7.2 or 4.7.1 supports Net Standard.
So yeah, so you do have access to quite a bit, and just for fun, nullable reference types are enabled on the project as well. So huzzah! Yes, if anybody wants to see that, there's a couple live streams where you can watch me beat my head into a wall implementing nullable reference types. The other thing go ahead.
Can I add one more detail to the history?
Sure.
One of the things that's worth pointing out, and I think this is why this is a remarkable milestone for us, as long as it's taken to get this back into .NET 6. And so the GA timeframe will be the same as the .NET 6 GA timeframe or sooner. One of the things that's really remarkable about this is that this effort has been an open source and community effort from the beginning. Everyone at Microsoft who has worked on this has done it as a weekends and nights kind of side project. Our management never said, go build a new command line parser. And so, contributions from Mark and Kevin, sponsorship from Intelitect, and just you can see the list of contributors there, right? Most of the people on that list are not Microsoft employees, and so we're really grateful to have the support we have, and we really want to encourage everybody to give us your opinions, give us your thoughts on the API, and help us make it better. This is a community project, despite I would say to a greater degree than what is common.
I would definitely agree with that. And so specifically too, if people want to get involved, there are issues tagged with like good first issue and things like that. So if you are saying, well, this might be interested in helping out, don't know where to get started, that's always a great way to do so. And John is usually fairly good about reviewing and merging PRs, even when they're mine, and he probably shouldn't, for what it's worth. One thing I did want to call out there is a bunch of docs written here, and there's some of it is a little dated, and a few things probably need to be updated. Again, that's part of why it's in preview, because we're figuring out APIs. But I think something that's important to note is some of the terminology here, because a lot of this terminology is kind of where a lot of the debates kind of originated from when we were trying to figure out how does this thing work in POSIX land, how does this work in PowerShell, and what is sort of a universally understood language, or something that could be reasonably understood by a lot of people, because every sort of, I guess, different command line sort of has a little bit different flavor. And so this is, when you hear us talking and using these terms, these are, I guess, the key ones to understand. And I'm going to actually break down a little bit and do these out of order, John, if you don't mind. So the one that most people are familiar with, because you can imagine, I mean, pick your favorite command line app, right? Some people might pick something crazy like Git, but whatever, we'll work with you. When you hear us say something like an option is typically this thing on the command line that you specify, typically with some sort of prefix, and then occasionally followed by a value, or this is what would end up getting called an argument to go along with it, right? In some people's land, it's a hyphen or the two hyphens. Sometimes it's a single hyphen, maybe if you've got a shortened one. Sometimes it's a /. And system command line sort of supports all of these out of the box, kind of like John was saying before, of trying to make that end user experience helpful, because at the end of the day, the person running the command line app should really have a good experience. And I have to say, the more I've used this, the more I dread when I find a new command line app that has reinvented the wheel and done something different and out of the ordinary, because it just doesn't work the way I want, right? And so it's worth calling out when we say option, this is what we refer to as effectively some sort of switch that you might pass into your command line app. And then obviously multiple different ways of passing an argument value into that. The other one that we'll get into a little bit is the concept of commands and subcommands, right? And for people who are familiar with like the .NET CLI, you're already sort of familiar with this already, right? If you type, for example, and whoop, .NET new, right? So this is a command potentially that you've already learned and run already. But in the terminology that we have here, .NET would be your root level command, right? The name of your executable, or the name of the program. And then underneath that would be the new command or a subcommand underneath that root level command, whereas help would then be an option passed to it, right? How'd I do, John? Close?
Sounds great.
Sweet. So just to make sure that everybody's kind of on that same page as we start talking about those things, that's I guess the key terminology. And I will even go as far as to drop that link in the chat if people are interested. There's a few more things in here around like arguments and arity, but I think we're going to call that extra complexity, and we'll get into that when we touch it. So fair enough? Cool. Okay, we should do something with code now. Code sounds fun.
Ooh.
Okay, so one of the things that I'm going to just point out here real quick is on the README, one of the easiest things to overlook is you go to grab this library and you can find it right out on NuGet. The issue is the NuGet updates don't happen quite as often as somebody might like, right? John could give a bunch of details on the extra effort that goes to doing a full NuGet release. But if you're interested in just give me the latest bits, right? I want to play with this thing. I want to see, you know, the change after my pull request went in. This package reference here is what you want to end up adding into your NuGet config. So what I have here is a basic command line app. And inside of my NuGet config, you'll note that I've gone through and added in, and I just named it .NET Public, right? But I've pulled in the system command line library by referencing that. So I'm running something a little more latest and greatest than what you're going to find out on NuGet. So if you start to run into issues, because there are some known bugs that have long since been fixed from the NuGet release, please pull in the one from this feed here.
There are also a few breaking changes, and that's part of why it's been a while since we've done a NuGet release. Is that I was trying to be mindful of batching up the breaking changes into one big breaking change rather than dribbling them out gradually over time. And but that the version that we're going to be using today, I will get it out on NuGet by the end of the week.
Ooh, you heard it here first. So
you heard it here first.
Preview announcement. This version will be published most Ricky tick. So the one thing I will point out too is in my CS proj. So you'll know I am using Net 5, but like we said earlier, you don't have to. You can go back earlier. But I'm not actually pulling in system command line. So there's another package on that whole list called Dragonfruit. And one of the things that this library has kind of aimed to do is separate what we called an app model from the actual core library functionality. So everyone has, I would say, probably their own opinion of their favorite way to build a command line app, right? Hopefully your answer isn't, I'll just parse this string array myself. That's not a great option. But there's a whole bunch of command line libraries out there that give you kind of a lot of different options, right? Maybe you make a POCO and decorate it with some attributes, or maybe you've got some sort of method syntax thing that it does. Regardless, everybody kind of has that sort of feeling. And so when we started this project, we started to think, okay, what kind of app model might we build on top of this library, right? To try to give a friendlier face to building command line apps to try to make things as simple as possible, right? And Dragonfruit was one of the first app models that got thrown into here, and it's stuck around due to its incredible simplicity for building command line apps. So we kind of got to thinking about, you know, what if I could build a command line app today, throw away everything that I know from years past, what would be my ideal situation? And obviously I've named this thing file converter. And so the thing that always comes to my mind when doing file conversions is what an awesome file format YAML is, right? Everyone loves it. I mean, white space indented stuff. So let's build something that might, or at least pretend to convert something YAML-y, right? So rather than going through and building out a main method with some string args here, what if we could actually go through and just build a strongly typed main method, right? I don't want to have a string args. At the end of the day, if I'm going to do a file conversion, right, I might have a file info for some sort of input file, right? I might have maybe a directory info for some sort of, output directory. Boom. And my font size is big, so I'm going to start doing this for the purpose of my own sanity. And then let's imagine here, maybe some sort of enum, right? Output type, right? And so we might say, we should always have a default 0th member on an enum, so maybe an unknown. And then clearly YAML is the best, so it goes next, right? And then
You
maybe we'll
misspelled
do.
output.
Say again?
You misspelled output.
You are so picky. Spelling. The rule in industry is you don't have to spell accurately, you have to spell consistently. At least
I'll buy that.
that's my thing. And so
That's the cancellation token story.
Okay, so let's do output type, maybe output type. And I'm kind of done, right? Ideally, if and then inside of my main method, do cool stuff here, right? This is ultimately, ideally, if I could actually have my ideal CLI app, this is how simple I would want it. So let's have some fun with it, right? So if I do, that repo that got linked earlier, I just realized I'm not in the right directory because that would have been smart and correct. So let's go into file converter. And then obviously we nested it an extra level deep for reasons, bin, debug, net something or another, right? So if I look at this, and let's just give ourselves something to look at, right? So console, right line. I'm going to be lazy here real quick, and I'm just going to cheat. So rather than thinking too hard, how about just, paste something like that in, right? So we'll just dump some output, pretend like we're doing YAML conversions, because that only takes a couple lines of code anyway, right? I mean, YAML is such a simple and straightforward format. Okay, so I'm gonna build it from Visual Studio and run from the terminal, if that doesn't cause anybody too much headache, just so we don't have to deal with like .NET runs, right? And so if I come in here, I can now do file converter, right? And you'll note I can type -- help, right? And right out of the gate, without me doing anything, I've got something that kind of looks like a sane help output. It's not great. I've got not great helpful text along here, but I've got something kind of built into this idea here of I've got some sort of input file, I've got an output directory, and I've got an output type. Right? And it's even being helpful enough to tell me, hey, for your output types, these are your valid options. Now, it's unfortunately completely missed my intent of YAML being the best thing ever and put it at the end. But aside from that, it's great, right? So so real quick, just proof is in the pudding, right? So let's actually do this. So input file, right? And you'll note there was something very subtle that kind of happened there, right? So I did --I tab. And you'll note I got auto completion right inside of my executable. This is probably one of the coolest features of System Command Line, is the ability to gain tab completion inside of your app. So, John, do you want to explain what magical incantation is happening?
I will try. So what's happening here is the way that completion works typically is you have a script somewhere in your shell, right? It might be PowerShell, it might be Bash, it might be Z shell, it might be Fish. There's many different shells and many different forms of scripts that you can use to supply completion. So when you hit tab, the shell calls the script gives back the answers, and the convention that's common across all of those is the answers come back as a list, a new line delimited list of suggestions. So one of the, and this is one of these things where a dedicated developer who wants to spend a lot of time crafting a command line application can go and write these scripts for all these different, all these different shells. But most people don't want to do that or don't have the time to do it. And the result of that is that the end user experience is not as nice as it might be. So this is one of these places where the end user experience is something we wanted to see if we could move that forward and not make developers have to think about it too much. So what's happening here is we have a universal script, and that universal script's role is once you put it into it's per shell, you put that script into your profile, and what it does is it basically redirects the request for completions to your command line app, which answers with a tab delimited list of suggestions. And so this is one of these examples where the parser model is able to do something more than just execute your code, right? It can tell you about the expected symbols at various positions inside of the command line.
Yeah, and for those people who are interested in seeing it, it is buried underneath this docs page for a global tool called .NET Suggest. So if you are interested in what I had to go and set up, there are 2 steps to the entire process. Install a global tool. So .NET tool install .NET Suggest -G for global, right? And then you need to add in the appropriate shim script into your terminal of choice, right? So in my case, I'm powwowing in PowerShell. So this is the shim script. If you look at your profile, you will note that mine has this in here. There's a small gotcha that's worth noting about making sure that you go through and restart your shell, especially after adding a new tool. It doesn't pick things up right away. It's only going to run this because it's part of your profile on start. So you do need to make sure that you restart it, or otherwise make this code execute, right? Otherwise it won't exist. You won't have the right information. Things will be sad, right? So worth noting there. So if you are wanting to get tab completion working inside of your terminal, that's what you need to do. And the nice part is then after that point, any global tools that you install that are built with system command line, you will get tab completion for, which is just awesome, right? And that includes the .NET CLI, right? Because once again, it's now built with system command line, so you just get that for free, which, yay.
There's an extra nuance to the .NET CLI version of this story, and we're looking at ways to converge these. The plan, and we're trying to figure out what time frame we will do this in. And again, it's something that might depend on whether we get contributions. That might accelerate it. If we come out ahead of schedule in .NET 6, that might accelerate it. But the idea would be for .NET Suggest actually to not be needed, and for all of this completion infrastructure to be in the box with the .NET CLI itself, which would simplify this story even further.
Right, because 2 steps was too hard. We'd like it to be 1 step.
Yes, or none.
Or none would be cool. You just
gestures for installing the shim script for you as well, or something
correct.
We're investigating.
So that is the tab completion. So if you are looking for a compelling reason of why would I build my tool with this, I would argue that is a highly compelling reason of it will give your end users tab completion when using your tool, and that will make them very happy, right? So just proof is in the pudding. I run this guy here, and you will note that this guy did go through and output a whole bunch of stuff. It's kind of big and ugly because the output shows full name of each of these, but you can see that it did resolve and figure out that I typed in myfile.yaml. It converted that to a file info for me. More importantly, it paid attention to my working directory and resolved that as a relative file path and all of that extra jazz. And it knows that ideally I want to do YAML conversion because
that's the ideal.
That is the ideal. So there's a couple more things that we can go through and kind of expand out here. So one of the things that was kind of obnoxious that we had there is the help description, right? Because you'll note I had a couple extra options here that I didn't write anything for, right? Just by just by virtue of using Dragonfruit, it went through and tacked on a, hey, being able to get the version of my app. That's kind of a common thing, right? Being able to get help. That's kind of a common thing, right? But the problem with the help output is it kind of looked ugly, right? It didn't really have, so my memory is short, right? It had some nice strings for version and help, but these things, it just tacked in kind of the names of the variables. That's not overly helpful. Well, in Dragonfruit, I can just go through and I can tack in the information from my XML docs. And if you go through and add the XML docs to this, and then I come back here, right, and rerun help, you'll note now I've picked up some stuff. And I can see that when I type my docs up, I clearly put periods at the end of 2 out of 3 of these. And so that's not a great look, but but at least it was able to pull that information in for me, right? The other thing that we can do here is we can say, well, you know what, making the user specify output type every time is kind of annoying, right? Everybody, again, obviously wants YAML, right? There is no reason why you would never want YAML.
It had a star next to it.
Right. I mean, that is clearly the most common use case. So, I mean, we can go through and say, okay, well, now we've got a default value of YAML. So if I go back to this, I can now drop output type from my invocation. And when I pass it, you'll know it still defaults to YAML, right? If I decide that, I'm crazy, right, and CSV is the way to go, right? It is the way of the future. We can still go through and specify it, but it now gives us a very easy syntax, something very familiar to a lot of people who've done C#, right, with the default output or the default ones here. The only other thing that's kind of a little bit of a rub is this kind of static call, right? Like John mentioned earlier, some of the old command line APIs they kind of are showing their age just a little bit, right? They were written back before a lot of this cross-platform stuff, right? And so if I wanted to go through and hypothetically write a unit test for this, right? You end up doing some really ugly stuff around dropping in your own text writer on console and all this kind of stuff to inject some way of actually capturing that output and doing appropriate testing on it. Mark has a library out on the IntelliTech repo that's built around doing command line input and output testing because it's kind of this unwieldy API. And it's surprising how much code it takes to do it reasonably well. But inside of system command line, we can actually go one step further, right? So I can grab a console, and I've got this iConsole implementation, right? And I'm just going to, because I put it at the end, I'm going to just tack that guy on. Oh, and it would like to add some XML docs for me. Sure. Give me a simple one here. But this here now gives me something a little bit friendlier that I could go through and interact with, right? And if we look at the implementation of iConsole, or at least what is on this, right, is it's got a couple things, and you'll note these kind of follow a similar pattern. So we're just going to look at standard out because that's what matters, right? There's this concept of an output redirected stream, but rather than the standard text writer API, which is what the system console exposes, you end up with just this simple interface which just has a simple write method on it, right? No more text writer going one character at a time and going ding, 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 right? You can have what feels like a little bit nicer interface interaction between your app and the console, right? So then if we come down here, we can go ahead and change this guy here. So we gotta change it. We can't just do console write line. We have to tell it which way to go, right? Because you've got air, out, etc. And we can put that here. But then if we go and look, because we've now added this extra parameter here, right? Let's take a quick look at what happens if we run the help output now. Right? So you'll note that console parameter doesn't show up anywhere, right? This is a magic parameter. For people familiar with DI, it's kind of DI-like, right? It shows up and exists. And just to prove that the app still works, right? I can still run it, and it's sure enough, as you would expect, dumps out to standard out. But it now gives me this nice, easy way to be able to interact with the console in a much more friendly implementation. The other thing that's really cool And for people who want to go way back, because I started to do a bit of a talk on this, is we actually ship 2 implementations of iConsole inside of the library, right? One of them is the one that does exactly as you would expect, right? It dumps out to console standard out. The other one is an in-memory output, right? And you might ask, hey, well, what good is that? Well, one, for testing, it's really great, right? It makes writing tests over these things very easy. And more importantly, since that implementation ships in the library as well, you can use it. The other thing is we have tests that go against both the real one and the in-memory one to verify that both of those work together, right? To verify that the in-memory one is a reasonable implementation. I believe the pattern John pointed me to a while back was the port adapter simulator pattern, which is a wonderful thing. Because this now in-memory implementation is a good replacement and we've got tests to prove it, it means that if you need to do anything where you might want to capture that output, there's now a simple implementation that you can use in either your tests or your command line apps to go and have fun.
The thing that, just to add a note to the simulator thing, a lot of people like to use mocks for testing, and I will typically recommend trying this approach instead. And it's sort of like a mock, but you write tests for the mock and you use the same tests for the mock as well as for your actual code under test. And so because we tested the test console in that way, and we test system command line using the test console, it's our way of guaranteeing for ourselves and for anyone using it that the mock matches the behavior of the real thing. So
for anyone interested, hit me up. I've got talks and videos on the topic. It's wonderful. Okay, so this is Dragonfruit. So if you are looking for a quick and dirty way to actually get a command line app up and you've decided, hey, I've got to build this app for somebody, this is probably the easiest way to get up and running, right? We're going to go dive into some more features of the library because Dragonfruit, in its simplicity, also comes with some limitations, right? You'll know there's no way to basically structure something like a .NET new with those subcommand type things built in. There's not necessarily a clean way to say, well, if rather than -- input file, I also want to let somebody just type -i, right? Those are other features that are available in the main library, but Dragonfruit doesn't really give a mechanism to expose those. And again, those types of interactions, we want to make sure that the core library supports, and you are free to build whatever you need on top of that to make whatever app model you want up and running. But Dragonfruit, like I said, has been one of those. It started kind of as a proof of concept, and it's just really easy to work with, especially for that simplistic use case, because oftentimes I'm not building a CLI that needs a lot. I need something that can do file conversion, right? Okay, so John, I'm bored of Visual Studio. There's too much. Let's do something simple because I don't want to type a bunch of samples in Visual Studio.
Okay. Let's
use something more interesting.
What could it possibly be?
Well, I heard about this cool new thing called a notebook. And I was told you knew something about it.
I know a little about it.
So I went and I installed this .NET Interactive Notebooks extension, right? And I'm on the preview of VS Code, but I was told that there was a normal version of this for normal VS Code as well.
Yep.
So I got this thingy, and I was thinking that this sounds like a great way to go through and do just kind of some quick code samples to show off system command line.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? Does that sound like a good idea?
I think sounds like a great idea.
My history is giving me away. You press F1 and create new blank notebook kind of shows right up at the top. I guess we're going to go there. That sounds awesome. And I'm going to save this because if I don't, I'm going to totally botch something and it's going to go poorly. So this is C#. That's no fun. Let's make it markdown and we'll do something like hello .NET user group. Again, spelling is hard for me, especially with so many people watching. And then let's see if I do that maneuver. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Okay. So John, what is .NET Interactive?
So .NET Interactive started out life as an offshoot of Try.NET, a way of doing interactive programming. That Try.NET was all about documentation, and then we said, well, let's also take a look at this data science space, classroom space, learning experiences. There's a lot of overlaps between these, and Jupyter Notebooks are the most popular notebook platform. Notebooks are it's a form of literate programming where you can mix code and documentation together, or text of some kind. The original the implementation that kind of set the stage for notebooks is Mathematica. Some people might remember that, might be familiar with it. But Jupyter took some of the same concepts, and it's the term Jupyter is squishing together of the terms Python, Julia, and R, which are 3 different languages that are popular in science and analytics. So .NET Interactive started out, trying to provide some better data science tooling for .NET. And from there, what we found is that there's a lot of other use cases for it. So prototyping, learning, documentation, classrooms, not having to dive into the command line from step 1 if you're trying to learn a new language. And one of the things that we did here is we built it to be polyglot by default, so you can mix different languages within the same notebook. And so we'll Markdown is one example of that, but there's some others in there as well.
I was gonna say I saw several. Obviously, Markdown was the easy case. I can do a heading because I remember my Markdown syntax. But I'll note I've got C# .NET Interactive here, and I can click it, and I've got all kinds of fun stuff: F#, HTML, JavaScript, PowerShell, SQL. Because why not have all kinds of fun with it?
YAML is something we've been looking into.
Excellent. I've been really hopeful for that. I mean, all good configuration language eventually morph into programming language, and that's clearly the path YAML is on. Okay, so we're gonna jump in, and in the interest of kind of going a little bit faster, I'm going to just preemptively grab some code that I have here. So the first cell here, there's all these kind of fancy pound commands, right? And one of the first ones I'm going to do is this £R, which is pull in library, right? Or is that reference NuGet package? Is that a better way of saying the £R?
Yeah, so £R in F# and C# in the scripting side of the world for both of those languages started out as a way to reference a DLL directly, and for .NET Interactive we added support for referencing NuGet packages as well.
Which is excellent. And then I'm just bringing in a couple using statements that will be helpful later. So if you are interested, or you go to copy this code and you're unfamiliar with where something might be, these are all of the ones here. I'm just going to actually go through and show this really quick. So inside of here, you can kind of guess. We've gone to quite a bit of effort, or I should say John's gone to quite a bit of effort to try to make these namespaces as intuitive as possible. So if there's something that you're looking for, hopefully it makes sense of where it might fit in the relevant portions. And then obviously our output type enum. Now obviously somebody put YAML at the end, which is clearly not correct. It is the most important language, therefore it goes at the top. Right? So let's go through then. So I'm just going to hit go. So I can see at the bottom here it says Control Alt Enter to run. Right? So I can just go whoop, and it ran, and we're happy. So now we can do stuff with it. So let's do stuff with it.
I want to point out one detail there is that the £R in this case actually isn't necessary for this specific library because .NET Interactive already uses system command line. So you can, in this case, you actually don't need to reference it. If it were a library that we didn't already build against, you would need £R NuGet and not £R.
Ah, see, I'm learning new things already. Sorry, you said £R new. Oh, I cannot type.
£R, yeah, just inside the quote, do NuGet colon. If you just run the cell again, it should.
That should unblock and let me type.
Yep.
There we go. So £R NuGet is the magic.
Put NuGet colon inside of the quotes. This was a pre-existing syntax. We actually £R YAML. We could definitely add support for that if you want.
That would be awesome. I don't know what package library YAML would pull down from. Probably NPM, based on how my week's been going. Okay, so but we'll leave that there. So I think where we're going to go here is we're going to start sort of exploring what is the base foundational system command line library, right? This is what is inside of the .NET CLI. This is what is expecting to go GA in the not too distant future, and also what has a bunch of breaking changes. So make sure you're on the preview NuGet feed rather than the NuGet one, or wait until after this week where John promises to update it. In either case, if you want latest bits, the preview one's good. So let's start with something like, so before on our thing, we had, right, our file converter had a root command, right? And that was it. So we'll go through and kind of see what it would take to do what Dragonfruit did for us if I was to type that manually, right? What would I put in the actual main method, per se, right? And so inside, oh, I guess we don't need to do that. Inside of the root command itself, I guess we need a couple options, right? So I need an option that's a file info, right? And I want the file info to have an alias. So going back kind of to that documentation thing at the beginning, the name portion of what you might specify for an option within the library is called an alias, right? So we had something that was called input file, right? That was auto-generated, and it may have been file to convert or something, right? And then let's see, new option. Actually, here, I'm going to save myself a little effort. In doubt, cheat, right? So roughly akin to what we had in the other side of it is I've got a command, a couple options. They've got aliases. They've got outputs. My output type one has a default value, so I can make it pull, you know, whatever default type. Again, obviously YAML's the best output type, so we work with that. And then I guess the only other thing we need then is some way to actually to do the thing with the command, right? So we'll go with command and we'll add a handler to it, right? So this is going to take a command handler, and this guy takes in a create. And I think this is probably one of the most confusing areas of the API currently, pending NuGet release. So
yeah,
I'm gonna show an API that is likely changing, right? Is that?
I don't know that we would break this but we'll probably add a less confusing approach to it, which we're still in the process of working out.
Excellent. So I'm going to pass in. So the command handler create method has, I don't know, a bajillion overloads or thereabouts, right? Let's see, handler method. We'll just call it that because that's big and long, right? And so we will come down here, and now I need to create, go away, IntelliSense. I need to create a method that matches this signature, right? So this is roughly analogous to what we had inside of our strongly typed main method, right? So if I call this handler method, right? And then we can go through, and I suppose I can actually just go back here and grab the same exact output line that I had from before, right? And we can just dump this in.
If you want to save yourself a little bit of left-right scrolling there, if you do Alt-Z, that will toggle word wrap.
Alt-Z. Oh, I am learning things. I love it. I'm new to this too, so. But John's the expert. I brought him along to make sure that I didn't make too much of a fool of myself, right? And now I think the only thing left is run it, right? So the easiest thing, I believe the easiest thing when it comes down to this is just take my root command and say invoke, right? And then let's give it, well, let's start with this. Let's start and see what our help output looks like, right? Does that seem reasonable? And there's a lovely fun issue here where every output gets put on its own line, which doubles the number of new lines. So that's exciting.
This is not a system command line issue. This is a .NET Interactive issue with handling the outputs.
Yes. So, and I'm just going to collapse that over because that doesn't need to be there. But we can see that we go through here. It gives us pretty much the same usage as what we had before. It does call out, you know, the name of the app that's actually hiding behind there because root command goes and looks it up, right? It's got various options, right? Showing my input file, my file to convert, right? And this ultimately comes down to, again, like John said, the .NET Interactive kind of has a different view of the way this terminal looks. So it's not quite the same as what it is on my command line, but reasonable enough to kind of look at here. So let's see here. What happens if we go through and do input file, right? So we'll do file 1, and then maybe we'll do put.
You misspelled output again.
Shh, making my
But
demo.
and you weren't consistent with the. Oh no, it looks fine.
Excellent. Because I wanted to show this part off.
Oh.
See, it even, this is another fun thing that system command line does. When you type as bad as I do, and you typo something, it actually will try and be helpful and figure out what it is that you intended to type. Okay, now I can do this.
If I'm not around to, spoil it.
Correct.
in real
If
time.
you don't have a John code reviewing, like Mark said at the beginning, if you can pair with John, you're golden, right? That's the perfect. This is a good second though, give or take. And you can see now we are processing file 1 as YAML into our output directory. Woohoo! I know everybody's muted, but I'm just imagining cheering and claps right now. That's what I would be doing. Okay, so that's all well and good. We've now successfully managed to re-implement dragon fruit in. I don't have line numbers here. There's not a hotkey for give me line numbers, is there?
I think line numbers are not yet supported in the notebook interface in VS Code.
Disappointing. Feature request if it's not on the board already. And I'll just clear the output to give me a little space. So let's keep going down. So one thing I found when I was playing with this the other day, there is copy cell down, which is just the best option ever when you're demoing. Whoop! And now I've got a new one to play with. So if we go down here, we called out kind of a couple things that were not really supported in dragon fruit, and kind of the reasons why you might elect to not use dragon fruit and instead go to rolling your own. Because the goal is to make the base API as easy as possible, right? It should not be difficult to go through and use the base library. Obviously, with that said, we try to have the base library be unopinionated and let the app models be where the opinions get added in, right? So that way you can kind of pick what level of control you want versus how much do you want the system to just do everything for you, right? So I think one of the ones that we called out was aliases, right? So the idea of, hey, I want to be able to pass, rather than just input file, I want to be able to do something like, -i, right? And so on our option constructor, right, buried underneath this, if I hit the down arrow once, you'll note that the very next overload says rather than just taking a single alias, I can pass a string of aliases. That is awesome. That's what I want. All right, so I want to do that. I want to do that. And then maybe we do the same thing here, right? We'll go through and say, rather than output directory, maybe a -o. Typing is really hard. Our viewer numbers are through the roof. Right, and we can do something like that. That's pretty cool. So let's actually see what that ends up doing for us. So if we run this with help, right, we can go and take a look, and we can see now that, hey, this is actually kind of handy, right? Is now rather than just specifying -- input file like I was doing before, right? I could take this level of command, and I'm just gonna. That's not what I wanted. I wanted that there, and I wanted to put that inside of it, right? So rather than doing -- input file, I can now just do -- and I can just go ahead and do O. And we're going to make changing the output type off of YAML as miserable as possible for people, because why would you want to do that? It's so much cooler this way. And that's all it takes to go through and add in aliases. So I'm sure most people can think of their favorite command line app here, and how often this is a kind of a fairly common thing. And it is somewhat a limitation of dragon fruit, but there are other app models that people have been working on. And so we're hoping to find maybe at least one more that kind of lands in a solid middle ground between, the simplicity of dragon fruit and, the complexity that is that a dozen lines of code. Because a dozen lines is a lot.
Mhm.
I mean, unless you're paid per line of code, in which case we'll try to expand it, stop using lambdas and whatnot. Cool. So let's clear that output. What should we show off next? What do you think? I like model binding. Let's go with model binding. That sounds cool. So we're going to copy cell down. Whoop. Look at this. So, and John, this may be something worth, I guess, explaining a little bit, because I just kind of threw the term model binding out there and didn't really dive too deep into what that actually means. Are there docs on this?
There are, and they're not fantastic, but we are, part of the release.
Are they in here?
I think there was a
model binding. They're probably under the one labeled with the exact title that I said.
That could be the case. Yeah, this looks reasonable.
Yeah. So links there, and this is one of the areas of the API that's, we'll say, getting a bit of a facelift in the near future, right? Okay, here.
Yeah. So the model binding. The single biggest gotcha in system command line has been around model binding and about parameters in general, right? So the parameters here, that handler method, you can use a delegate or you can create your own method like Kevin did in the notebook. The way that we're matching things up, the way that we match a token that was parsed out of the command line that was submitted to one of these parameters is by name, right? So if the option name is a string, we take out the hyphens because that's not valid in C#. We find a matching case insensitively, we find a matching parameter name on the handler method, and we bind that value to that parameter. And we try to we try to build something that will match that type as well. And you'll get an error if we can't match the type, right? So that's great for simple arguments, scalar values like ints, strings, things like this. It's pretty straightforward. But more complex objects, Kevin mentioned that the command handler create, I think we are now up to 16, an arity of 16 for each variant of that API, meaning you can do command handler create arg1, arg2, arg2, arg3, arg4, all the way up to 16. We did take it to 11 at one point, and even that wasn't enough.
People wanted more.
they continue to want more. So one of the suggestions one of the things that we built to sort of solve this problem is to allow you to use properties on a class instead of just adding parameters to this thing. And that term, if your argument is like this complex object, we call that model binding. We borrowed the term from ASP.NET MVC. It probably pre-existed that from Ruby on Rails. I'm not sure, but that's effectively what we're doing there. It's the same convention. We'll match up the name of a property or a constructor parameter on your model type and build that whole object graph up for you and pass it into your handler.
Yeah, so if we were to take, say, our existing sample here, right? And one other thing that I guess I want to call out is I've been being very nice and passing these things in the same order that they're declared, right? That does not have to be the case, right? You can pass options in any order you want, right? There are some things where the order of the tokens, the individual pieces here matter, right? Like if you're going to pass a value into a -i, right, the value has to be the thing that directly follows it, and that sort of thing. But in a large part, if you have an option, by definition, it's optional, right? And so it may be specified, it may not be, and they may be specified in any order, right? And so trying to figure out how you do that mapping, I've just been doing it in order, but that's not a requirement. And then more importantly, like John was saying, is, it's great to have this create handler that goes out to big number of parameters, but that gets unwieldy fast, right? And more often than not, what you're really interested in having is just give me the data off the command line that the person passed in, right? and get it into my method where I can now do work with it, right? I want to go and actually do stuff. So if we say, well, we're already at 3, going out to 16 sounds ridiculous. Let's start to scale this out, right? We can go through and we can create a class that has the same types that we have here. And again, the kicker that you'll note is, like John said, sort of that naming is important, right? The subtle joke inside of here is kebab case, I think is what we called this lovely hyphen form instead of Pascal or camel case. That was kebab. And be able to do that mapping there. So if we come in here and say, okay, we're going to get rid of all of this, right? This is done, right? Let's build out our conversion options. Splatting. I like splatting. Sorry, Thomas, I didn't see exactly which sentence I said that was in reference to. Was that in regards to mapping these things back and forth?
I think it's splatting in is it the ... operator?
Yes.
In JavaScript as well. That's at least prior to JavaScript, I think that was called a splat.
Gotcha.
Maybe it's still called a splat. I don't JavaScript enough these days.
I don't JavaScript much either. But JavaScript is supported out of the box in .NET Interactive. And I don't think we mentioned this earlier, but the languages or kernels that are supported in .NET Interactive, it's actually not terribly difficult to write your own. There are samples on the repo, and there are recordings where John has taught me how to do such.
Still waiting on a pull request for that YAML kernel.
I will get right on the YAML kernel as quick as I can. So here what we have is we switch out what we were doing previously, right? Rather than, splatting, sorry, detour. Splatting in PowerShell is combining parameters into a class or dictionary. Okay. So PowerShell splatting in PowerShell is the equivalent of what we have named model binding.
Yeah, I guess the JavaScript thing I was thinking of is the spread operator. It's a little bit different.
Got it. Okay, so rather than just mucking ourselves right into individual property or parameters into our handler method, which clearly is going to get unwieldy, especially when we get out to that 24th parameter that clearly I'm going to need at some point. We can go through and dump this into just a class. Once again, fancy naming to make sure all of the stuff lines up. But then if I come down here, right, and then run it, you can see that it clearly dumped out a toString operation with not useful display of the properties, but it shows it, right? And more importantly, it shows that we got into our handler with something being passed. Now, if I want to go through and see this, I could go and write out a toString, or I could change this thing here. Or we could have fun and play with one of the new C# record types, right? So rather than doing this whole mess, right, we can go with a record. And rather than just doing a record with auto properties, because everyone does that, that's easy mode, right? We can go with file info, input file, and I'm going to just do this for my own sanity. Directory info, output directory, and then output type. Wow, why is typing so hard? Right? We can go with something like that. And we'll just get rid of all these. Yeah, something like that. Run it. You'll note now, because records are really cool with all of the stuff that they give you, right? See previous YouTube recording of user group where Mark and I cover records. We now have a nice toString operation where it's passed in, and we can see that it did, in fact, bind all of our stuff here, right? And if we want to do something like, again, I don't know why people would switch off of YAML, but if you JSON, right? We'll go with JSON this time around, right? You can see that it's now bound into here, and inside of your handler, you can have fun. Just go at it. Do all kinds of fun stuff. Sweet.
The can I throw in a little detail here? Could you change that last thing that you typed to output type : JSON?
Ooh. I can. You want me to run it?
And how about maybe changing one of the other ones to, -o equals output?
Ooh.
I think.
And it all just works. It's magic.
So those are the supported delimiters out of the box, and this is actually one of the places I wanted to point something out here that might not be obvious. Is in the traditional, the classic .NET main method, you get an array of strings, right? You could have invoked this using an array, and had you invoked this using an array, or had you passed this on the command line, the traditional classic .NET main method would have received, in this case, 4 tokens: -i, file1, -o equals output, and -- output type :JSON. You would have gotten 4 tokens. This is one of that detokenization process is fairly complex to match the actual behavior of what happens when main is invoked. We also have we've done a lot of work here to make sure that our detokenization lets you pass in a complete string and will match the behavior at the command line when a user types a string, and the tokenization happens outside of .NET.
Right. So just to point out what you were saying there is the invoke method. I've just been powwowing on the first overload, or I should say second overload, I guess, that takes in a full string. But there is an overload here that does take in a string array, right? So if you're inside of your standard main method, you can just dump args straight out to it.
Yep. And this is one of those. Yeah, this is one of those subtle little things when people say, "Oh, I've got this." You had said earlier, "Oh, I could just iterate through the array that was passed in and just handle the strings that are passed. Why do I need a command line parser?" Right? This is one of these areas that starts to get more complex than it looks at first glance.
Right. So another reason to use the library and not roll your own, to make your users happy. Kind of like that. Cool. That is awesome. Let's show some more stuff off.
Ooh.
We're having so much fun. And also, this is like my favorite button ever. The copy cell down. Best button ever. Oh, was so happy when I discovered that one. Okay, so let's imagine, I guess, for sake of argument, right, that perhaps because we're doing YAML conversions, and because YAML is clearly the best thing ever, I've decided I'm a little pickier, right? I would like to be able to have 3-space YAML rather than 2-space YAML, right? But obviously, I don't want to break all of the people who are back on YAML v old, right? Who are still doing the old way of 2 spaces. It would be better if we had a new option, right? And maybe I'll take an int, right? Because that's clearly what we might want to do, right? And we'll go ahead and specify this, and maybe we'll do num spaces, and we'll give them a short alias too, because I'm feeling friendly today, right? But we might want to be a little bit nicer, right? The problem is in addition to passing 3 spaces, I was thinking passing numbers isn't real intuitive for me. I speak English, and actually typing out my numbers is clearly the way 3-space YAML was meant to be done, right? So rather than output type JSON, right, I would much rather do something like that, right? And I want that to work, right? Now, obviously, 3 doesn't parse as an int, unless you've done something horrendous inside of your code, right? So, given that, I'm thinking we should probably do something fancy here, right? Because this invoke, there's multiple kind of steps in the process, right? You mentioned the first one is obvious, of breaking this thing apart into its individual tokens. What else comes between, I guess, the breaking apart of that tokens and then invoking this handler, right? There's kind of a whole bunch of steps in that process.
Yeah, the thing so tokenization is the stage of attempting to identify what the different pieces are without worrying too much about the rules of how they can be put together. And then you get to the grammar part, and the grammar part is what are the rules of how they can be put together. So, that's when we enter the parsing stage. And all the parsing that we've seen so far is done by a bunch of different conventions, right? Like file info works because we have a string info, we have a string token, and the file info constructor, there's a file info constructor that takes in a single string. So we say, yeah, we can just call that constructor with a string. Model binding is a little bit more complex, right? We have a bunch of properties, and we can't satisfy them all. We'll end up with a parse error. We tokenize successfully, but we can't actually, bind that at that point. So during parsing, we can identify these kinds of failures and throw it back. Another one is if you have list types, right? How many times can I specify a given option? 0, 1 time, more than 1 time, right? We've sort of seen hints of that with when you specify a default value, right? We can say, oh, well, actually, you don't need to specify something for that. We understand that you didn't need to specify it because the parsing rules, what the grammar says, is allowed there, right? Say,
right, I can
you
do
don't need
this
to pass
0
this.
or 1 times on the command line.
Yeah, effectively. And then things like, what is a valid option? -- output with 3 T's in the word, right? Not valid. That's not valid inside of our grammar. So when you want to get outside of that set of conventions and do something a little bit more specific, we have this way to do custom parsing.
Ooh,
So
that's
just show me the tokens, and I'll figure out how to build the specified type.
So you'll note there's this overload here with this parse arguments delegate, which is rather a quite cool thing. So it's not completely intuitive from the IntelliSense there. So I'm gonna spell it out, right? Just to make it. Oh, that's a big and ugly A there. So we'll do right, and we'll just do a long thing here where we'll go through and specify something here, right? So this guy here is a parse result, and let's go through and see what we need to pass into here. So I'm going to just start with return 0 because I just want this thing to compile for a moment and be happy to make sure I didn't typo something, which is, as we've seen based on my prior stuff, highly likely. Why is it no happy with me? What did I miss? Comma there. Oh, it was literally the comma. Okay, so it was just unhappy with me. Excellent. Okay, so like John said, underneath the argument result, right? Come on. Sometimes stuff takes a little while to go up. We've got a whole bunch of stuff, right, that we can go through and do. There's error messages, children. We can look at the original bound argument for the option. But in our case, what's most interesting inside of this delegate is actually this tokens collection, right? And so let's take a look at that. Tokens, and I don't know, let's just grab the first one because, right? And so if we look at what's on a token, there are a couple things. We've got a token type and a value. So, John, I don't know, do we care about token types? I don't think we do in this case. I think in our case,
we will not. Yeah.
I think in our case, I really just care about what exactly is it that the user passed me, right? So let's go with string, I don't know, token value, right? And I see a first or default with a dot after it, which my internal compiler is freaking out, going, no, 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 must no coalesce, twitch, twitch, twitch. And what is your problem?
I think it's just catching up.
Oh. OmniSharp, speed up, please. Okay, and so
it's not using OmniSharp.
Oh, got it. What is it using?
We have our own language server.
Oh,
That's a discussion for another day.
Oh, perfect. I am intrigued. Okay, so now all we have to do is parse this string into something useful, right? So that's clearly, that sounds a lot like a switch statement, right? Because that's how I do all of my string parsing. Right, and so, for example, we might do 3, right, and we'll just map that into the number 3 so that it's hip to the idea, and then we'll let people do 2 because that's YAML old, and then 1 maybe, and then everything else obviously is 4 spaces because reasons that will become clear. I don't know. Right? This could probably be an int parse if you wanted to be nice to people, but nah, that doesn't sound like my cup of tea at the moment.
That's not the YAML way.
That is not the YAML way. Then we run it. Look at that. Num spaces is 3. That's so exciting. That makes me so happy. So I can now go through and I can just arbitrarily do whatever parsing I want in here, which is pretty slick. Is there anything else we're going to show here?
What if someone did pass in a value that you didn't want to accept, like an integer, something that actually parses? If you want to maintain the YAML style of your command line now of not allowing numerals.
Oh, that's a good point. That's a good point. So you're suggesting that perhaps we actually attempt a try parse here and do something a little different in the event that it is in fact. So if, right? So if it, like John said, in keeping with the spirit, right? So if it parses as an integer, right? We clearly want to disallow that, right? Nobody would pass a literal number to this thing. So then what do we end up doing? Is that back on that argument result that you had mentioned a minute ago?
Yep.
Argument result. And then it's just, do I just specify error message?
You just give it an error message and whatever you return at this point will just be ignored.
Allowed. And sure, return 0. All right, we'll break out early. We don't need to hit our switch. So now if I come down here and somebody decides, you know what? No, if you're going to make up a number, you make up the 42. Right? Anybody who's taken one of my Eastern classes from me knows that if you're going to randomly select a number, you can select any number you want as long as it's 42. So if we run this guy, oh, that's so mean. Numbers are not allowed. And you'll note by default when there is a parsing error, right? It does go through and display the help output just because that is a fairly common option there.
I think that we might make that optional. I think that behavior is likely to change.
Or at least configurable.
In fact, I think we already added it. I think this was one of the things because the .NET CLI used to do this at the time that the ancestor version of system command line was built, which is why we have that behavior. And they changed the behavior in the .NET CLI. So when we wanted to bring the system command line library in for the .NET 6 CLI, they said, got it. We don't want to show help. So I believe the option's already in there to be able to turn that off.
Sweet. Cool. So we have that. So one of the other things that kind of circling back to what we showed before, right, was those custom suggestions, or I should say showing suggestions with the tab completion, which those were pretty cool, right? Like tab completions are awesome. But I'm also kind of aware that what I have just built here is potentially what some would consider non-intuitive, right? It's probably doesn't make a lot of sense to people to say num spaces, type in 1, 2, or 3 versus a number, right? So maybe we should be a little friendlier to people here, right? Because it's not like the enum, right, where the help can just magically figure out and say, hey, by the way, these are the valid values, right? I don't really there's nothing here in our syntax that we've built that would communicate that back out, right? So let's see about that. It's right on the end of this, isn't it? So right on the tail end of this option, right? So just opening paren, closing paren of the option. I think I can just tack it right on, can I?
Yeah.
Right. So I can add in suggestions, which is pretty cool. I don't know. 1, 2. Oh, wait. We're doing this wrong. 3 is the right answer. So we're going to put it at the beginning, right? Because if you're going to give somebody suggestions, making sure that that 3 is there is probably important, right? And then I think the easiest way to get suggestions is to just ask for them, right? Because what we want to do is simulate what .NET Suggest is going to do on the command line, right?
Yep.
To be able to pull those things back. So I think all we do is, what is it, command, rather than doing the whole invocation, we just really want to parse, right? So let's do, I guess it doesn't matter a whole lot, does it?
If you scroll down a little bit, at least for me, I'm seeing my face is blocking the
Oh,
code.
you.
There you go.
That's right. I need to pay attention to that. I've forgotten that what I see and what you see are not quite the same thing. Thank you. So if we imagine that somebody types, n colon, right, and then hits tab right here, this is kind of where we're interested in seeing what the values would be, right? And then we can do something like get suggestions. And if I'm not mistaken, .NET Interactive is pretty hip to the idea of me just saying, yeah, let's return it.
Does that work?
I have no idea. Apparently not.
Here, try this. So that's not the common syntax that I've seen, but so this is the C# scripting variant. The C# scripting variant lets you do this thing called a trailing expression. So if you remove the semicolon, remove the return value.
Remove the semicolon,
But this
and
does
the
work.
return value. Hey, look, it does the same
That
thing.
works too.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
so this
even
is-
easier than the wacko syntax I was going for.
Yeah, I'm so used to looking at this that I didn't realize that the return value would work, but that is very cool.
So you'll note if I did, n space and then hit tab, the suggestions that it goes through and dumps out for me are 1, 3, 2.
Yep.
It's interesting to me that 1 came through first and then it
we
alphabetized.
alphabetize them because sometimes the suggestions may be coming from multiple different positions in the tree.
Oh, that's a good point. So there's not a common thing. So it's not the first thing in their tab completion, but it gets close. But if they were to type T and then do it, right?
And you can also pass in an argument to specify the position for the cursor.
Got it. Wait, I can do what?
In get suggestions, you can pass in.
Oh, so rather than having my cursor always at the end of the line where it typically would be, I could say, imagine the cursor was at 0 based, I assume, 0, 1, maybe 2, right? And then I end up with something akin to this where it hints at me whether I want n or num spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Which in this case doesn't matter. They're both equivalent. But hypothetically, if I wanted to try and hint to it, it could autocomplete. I am noticing a pretty clever thing here in that it's ignoring my prefixes.
It's doing more than that, actually. Change the N to an O in your parse in your command line input.
Hmm?
Yep, run that. Oh, actually, try a U. Let's try a U. No, now get rid of the dash.
Ah.
Okay. So what it's actually doing is it's not just the prefix that it's ignoring, right? It's the entire string around a valid identifier. Right? So command names and options are identifiers in the grammar of your command line interface, right? And so what it's doing is we're doing substring matching at any position because this is about discoverability, right? If you don't know what options are available, we'll just match everything. And you'll see that this is actually the same convention for completions in Visual Studio Code, for example.
Right.
When you invoke completions, and you can start typing and it'll do substring matching.
Right, to go through and try and guess it. For people like me who are like, I kind of know the word, but I don't know if that's a silent Q at the beginning or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because maybe I'm not sure. That's pretty slick. Cool. What else should we show? We've kind of gone through a lot. Questions from anybody? There's been a whole bunch of stuff that we've dumped in here. Is this useful, or does this make people want to build command line apps? One thing I'm going to just, I guess, tell a quick story on too is there was a project we were working on where we had some code that was generating a CLI invocation for a tool, right? And we were going through and we're like, the code itself is not using system command line, right? That's not a thing. But the intent was we wanted to actually unit test that project, and so the whole idea of parsing that string, right, was horrendous, right? There was a lot of things where different options could appear at different points in the string, and you could try and regex it for certain cases or do exact string matching. It was ugly, right? But one of the things that we then looked at doing, we're like, well, shoot, system command line already can parse and tokenize these things and give us back a reasonable result. We can then go and act on that result to figure out what we want. Because the return from this parse method is what's called a parse result class, which gives you kind of that level, right? Before doing any sort of like invocation, right? That would come from calling invoke. It lets you look at what the end result is and kind of get that syntax tree of, okay, here's the stuff that was there. Here's the values that go into each of those, and sort of figuring that out. There's a question for you, John, and I'm letting it be yours because I know the answer, of how do you handle pipe streams? For example, piping like the output of dir into my CLI, like which you can do in PowerShell.
So this, we don't currently support this, but we want to. And so one of the things, we looked at the iConsole interface, and our iConsole interface is very different from the .NET console static class that exists. You know, it's 20 years old. What we did with the iConsole abstraction was we whittled it down to what is, you know, the sort of the true console, which is standard in, standard out, standard error. We don't have standard in built yet, but we are in the process of working out what that should look like for the GA release, and making piping work just out of the box is one of the goals for that design.
I think I'm going to call out so if people are interested in tracking projects progress, there is a 2A GA milestone, and I think specifically the question, as you can see, the description is empty, but there's quite a bit of discussion in here. So like John said, figuring out what that should look like is I think the hard part, right? We want to make sure that we get a very good API that can function there. And like I said, making sure that the piping story works sort of out of the box and for free, so that you can have all of the interaction that you would expect and not have it be kind of a shoehorned in thing. Yep. So I think that's been the most interesting part of this project, is the long discussions of what should this look like, right? Because we can build anything, but whether it's the right thing is the hard answer.
This reminds me of a little side project that I have undertaken specifically to explore this question. And we're more than open to suggestions. And if you have ideas about how you would like it to work, we think that the thing that we want to do is we want to pass you an object that lets you read the stream, just the same way we passed you file infos and directory infos and, you know, things like that. In a lot of cases, we didn't really look at list types, right? But we'll synthesize lists for you. So if you have an option that accepts 5 different, or an arbitrary number, you can say, hey, give me a list of ints, or a list of file infos. So what is the right type to wrap that redirected input stream in? And, you know, especially if you want to be able to do sort of higher order things on top of it, right? It's some kind of a producer consumer stream, right? Do we want to be able to support things like back pressure on it? How do we want you to be able to test it? Because right now, console readline is just a black box. Those are the kinds of questions that we need to come up with answers to. And so that's something I've been experimenting with, and we would love your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so a couple questions from Seth. So I assume you can use this to just parse a string or a string array and get the model you bound, so that you can just add all the parsing to an existing console up. Yeah, that is exactly correct. So, and just to show that real quick, so the magical so a parse result is the class that you're looking for, and it comes directly off of that command parse method. So I'll just pass it an empty string, but you'll know, so buried underneath this parse result would be all of the stuff that you would be looking for. So there's a couple stuff for like if there were unmatched tokens, and then the root command result is probably where you want to, I guess, start if you were going to do some custom work on figuring out what to do inside of your app. Just like because like the .NET CLI has multiple subcommands in it, right? .NET is your root command, like new is a subcommand, right? And so figuring out what is the actual command chain that was invoked, because you can chain multiple commands together, but commands in a CLI app form a hierarchy. And at the end of the day, when it comes time to invoke, you're only invoking one command, right? It may be nested several layers deep, but there is only kind of one there. So if you were looking to do something fancy inside of your app beyond what we have with our regular invocation model, this is where you would go about doing it.
Yep. Yeah, so you can call these value for option, value for argument. The IntelliSense in .NET Interactive doesn't show the generic variants yet, but that's why you see that twice. That's another thing that we are working on fixing. But you can ask it for that value back. The other thing, there's find. So if you have a reference, and this is where there's an open PR for this. The improvements to the API to avoid the gotcha that I hinted at before but didn't actually describe. The actual gotcha is with the name-based convention. If you mistype, if the naming doesn't match up between your parameter name and the option name, it'll kind of silently just not populate that parameter for you. People have been stubbing their toe on this one from the very beginning. So this other approach is you can pass in just the option or argument itself into the parse result find option. I can't remember exactly what the API is.
Right. So I think it's something like find or value
find
for
result
option,
for.
right?
So value for option will do find result for and then do the bind back to the type you're asking for. Find result for will just get you the argument result or option result or whatever it is that you saw before in the parse delegate.
Right.
Right. So these are ways of exploring the parse tree.
Right. So yeah, so you don't necessarily need to walk through the entire tree yourself if you don't want to. There are these nice helper methods where you might cache, this option off in a variable so that you can say find result for, my input file option, etc. Right.
Yep.
And
you can use that inside the parse delegate too. So sometimes the parse delegate can be useful sometimes if you want to validate the input for one option against the value for a different option. So you can use find result for to go look up that other option and say, oh yeah, you can't use YAML, and
2 spaces.
2 spaces. It's just not
Right.
allowed. If you want 2 spaces in your CSV, go for it. But
Right.
those
That would be perfectly acceptable.
Yeah.
Is there magic around file info parameter where you can require the file to exist? Yes. And we did not show that. I believe I can just tack it right on the end here, can I?
Mhm.
So there is a fancy method that exists on the end of specifically options that derive from, file system info, the base class of file info, that will let you say, okay, if this is going to be an input file, I want there to be an error if the file doesn't already exist, right? There's obviously the potential timing collisions there, right? Because especially if you use this where you're chaining commands, where does the file exist, right? Because it's the same issue with calling the static file exists method of what do we do here, right? So what this is actually tacking on there is a validator onto the end of, or into this option. There's also overloads on the options for you to put your own custom validators there as well. You can imagine, hey, I want it to only be an existing file, and by the way, it has to come from the downloads directory or something, right? You could put in your own validation logic if there was something that you wanted in there.
Yeah, requiring a specific file extension or whatever.
Right. Similar, right? We left the validator API open for you to extend as you see fit, because there's no way we can guess at all of them. But existing file is a pretty common use case, so it kind of shook out there a little bit.
That's one that's also in. It's undergoing some changes right now. Right now, the validator API that we have actually validates against the tokens that were passed in, which often requires you to then go and kind of reparse them or think about them just as strings. But usually for validation, you would rather deal with the file info object, right? Not a string. Or for an int, you want to be able to do, the int must be greater than 3. You don't want to have to parse the int because that's going to happen somewhere else anyway. So we're gonna change the validator API to move it to after the binding step. Which
makes a lot more sense, because most of the validators I've written tend to do exactly what you said, reparse the thing itself. And pull
we think
that
that
out.
the former scenario of validating the tokens prior to parse is also valid, but we think that this parse delegate approach here is the cleaner way to do that now.
Mm-hmm. There's also something else that we didn't really highlight in here. Is there's sort of another piece of this grammar that's kind of, I guess, a little bit hidden, right? So there's a concept called directives, and I don't know, is there an analogous to that in any other stuff? It feels.
The analogy that I've used for it is they're sort of like headers in HTTP.
That makes a lot of sense, because there's quite often times where you want to be able to go through and do stuff with meta level stuff with your command line. So one of the ones that I absolutely love, because very consistently these things are nice to build locally in Visual Studio and whatnot, and everyone's happy. But then the problem almost immediately arises that, oh shoot, now I have to debug this thing, right? And how is that going to work, right? So if I go back to my sample here, right? So you can imagine I've taken this app and deployed it out somewhere, right? And maybe it's misbehaving for some reason. I can't figure out why the heck this thing is allowing somebody to have a 2-space YAML file, for example, right? And so the directives exist inside of this kind of square brace syntax. And one of the key ones, I guess the one I'll highlight because I find it to be the most useful, is the debug directive. Of you can go through, and when you call it, what it directly says is, because this is kind of we'll say somewhat risky, right, to allow somebody to just arbitrarily attach up to your process, it does sort of require a 2-step thing. But you'll note, add your process name to this environment variable, right? So I'm just going to grab that guy real quick, env, whoop, and you'll note it actually gives me the exact name of what I need to put in there. So if it had tacked on the $env, it would be valid PowerShell. So I can what? What? Oh, did I need to something more like that? And then if I go through and actually kick off the debug, right, you'll note now when system command line takes over right at the very beginning, what it does is it goes through and pops this message and says, okay, we are fired up and running. Here's the PID, go and attach your debugger to it, right? So then I can take any debugger that has access to the symbols for my app, or in this case, the app itself, right? And I can just go, okay, attach to process, and filter down to my process. And then, oh, I probably should have put a breakpoint on it because no breakpoints, the thing just ran, which is all kinds of exciting. So let's try that one more time. Attach. And then poof, I hit my breakpoint and I can, do all the stuff that I would normally do to figure out and start stepping through my code. So yeah, and John just dumped in a whole list of them as well, of all of the other ones that exist. So there's ones for parsing. There's the suggest directive, which is ultimately what .NET Suggest ends up using under the hood to be able to call your app and pass the appropriate information to say, hey, what are my suggestions at this point? And again, it's just one of those, there's yet one more feature kind of built in that you don't have to think about building into your app, right? You just get it for free by referencing the right NuGet package. So any other questions?
One of the use cases there for directives and thinking about it's a little bit analogous, especially with headers. If you want to take the analogy one further to HTTP headers, it's a little bit like content negotiation in a way. You're saying, hey, I don't want you to actually run this code. I want you to do something different with it. And so there's a middleware pipeline in system command line that lets you intercept behaviors and do something different. And so that's exactly what's happening here. We can get the parse result in, and we can look at it in the middleware, and we can say, you've got this directive there. We're going to do something different. And these behaviors can be completely orthogonal to what the actual logic is inside of your main method, right? In this case, with the dragon fruit example, right, your main method doesn't get called. It doesn't make it that far because the parse directive or the suggest directive short circuits the execution and returns a different result back.
Right, just like how my main method, I was able to set the breakpoint at the beginning. The debug had to stop prior so that breakpoint would then be in the path for it to run into. Yep. One other comment in here, I don't know if we do. It says, do we have time to look at command line builder class using a host with dependency injection? And thank you, Thomas. I appreciate the compliment. I don't know if we necessarily do, but I feel like I want to at least point you in the right direction of where I believe there's a sample in the app, if I'm not mistaken. Is that true? I don't know, or is it
Hosting
not in?
Playground.
Was it?
Yeah, go back one. The hosting playground has this in there. So there's this. It's a different project, which is system command line hosting. That will not be GAing in the same time frame. But it is still it's small, but it's very useful. So if you're using the generic host, you can use this to pull in logging, DI, and other kinds of things that you might want in a more sophisticated application.
Right. So yeah. So specifically, and I think this is probably what you were kind of driving at, Richard. Of hey, I want to go through and have the ability of injecting my own stuff. In this case, the sample is a greeter. And actually, real quick, let me just grab a link to this in the chat so that it's sitting out there for anybody who wants to take a look at this. But then going through exactly what you were saying with the command line builder, I don't know, is this actually needed here anymore? I think you could probably just have this be root command invoke, can't you? On this? Oh no, the use host is tacked onto the command line builder extensions. You're right. But you'll note then once you get into here, you do have access to be able to pull your services out. And that kind of thing back and forth. Those magic parameters that I commented before with like iConsole that are sort of injected for you. I use the air quotes because it's not real DI. Inside of the system command line base library, it's not like there's some internal DI container. There's just a well-known set of things that you can get access to. By adding parameters onto the end. I think the two most common ones that you would probably end up using would be the iConsole to get access to the console implementation, and then the parse result are probably the two key ones that if you're wanting to do something kind of custom inside of your command handler, that's probably between those two, you usually get access to just about everything that you would need. I'm trying to remember what the other ones are. Those are the only
cancellation token is another good one.
Oh, cancellation token. I just don't ever let my thing be canceled. Who needs to cancel my? If I'm converting YAML for you, I do not want that canceled.
Maybe you do. Maybe someone is trying to convert a YAML file that is so large that it just looks like it's hanging, and you've got other things to do, and you want to move on with your day. That's
a good point. That is a good point. Or maybe I want to encourage large YAML files. I'm not sure.
Maybe both.
That'll. We'll wait and see. But hopefully, Richard, that kind of points you at least in the right direction of what you could set up. These sample projects are small, but they are out here to try and represent hopefully what is the simplest possible example of doing something inside of the library. It's not great for the host builder, but there is actually a huge suite of tests across this entire project. The code coverage on this project is ridiculously high, in my opinion. And so if there is an API that seems unfamiliar or doesn't make sense, if there's not something in the samples or the docs showing it off, my very next go-to is I always just go digging through the tests, because usually the tests show off sort of what I'm looking to understand. So perfect. Other questions? I know we're 15 minutes until Nicole jumps in and tells me I have to stop talking. Which is unfortunate because this stuff is so much fun. And I know Nicole posted that link in there as well, but I'll just call out that inteltech.com/YouTube. So if people are interested in the recording or whatnot of this, that is where it will get posted. You actually have 14 minutes. I like my clock better, Nicole. Though yours may be more accurate. I'm sure mine's slowed down with all of the streaming and everything bundled into here. Cool.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I'll expand a little on the cancellation token thing.
Yeah, go for it.
I don't know. There's a PR, and we either just merged it or it's very close to being merged to allow cancellation to be, and this is one of these kind of end user consistency of experience things, is one cancellation means cancel on your own time, please, command line app, right? Mm-hmm. So if you have a cancellation token in your handler, you can use that cancellation token to check and say, the user has asked for cancellation, right? Control C
Right.
or whatever. And then you can do some stuff. Maybe you want to clean things up. Maybe you want to stop converting the YAML file, but you want to do it in a way that leaves a valid YAML file. You don't want to leave two trailing spaces, or two spaces and then a new line in a 3-space YAML file.
Right.
Your YAML file parser is not going to like that. But on the second Control C, that will, we will allow the program to exit, so less gracefully at that point. So that's the kind of thing you can do with the cancellation token. Merely asking for the cancellation token to be injected into your handler wires up all that for you.
Right. And so just to be clear, what that is effectively saying is one of my magical parameters here is cancellation token, right? And then cancellation token. I will say that is one of those things that I can never remember the right number of letters. But yeah, and then this just magically shows up and everyone's happy, right? So we can run this. Cancellation token. Am I missing a using directive? Probably.
We'll get the code actions out there one of these days. Is it system threading?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe that's where it lives. Hey, huzzah! Right, but then I actually get a token that's buried in here, and something like token is cancellation requested, right? So if you wanted to check for it, right? Currently there was no cancellation requested.
Your head is in the way of that result. I can kind of tell what it is.
Thank you. I need to have something on my screen that just draws a box where my head is. I've been meaning to write myself something. Probably needs to be a command line app.
Oh, for sure.
I probably need to pass it a rectangle. That would be a fun little parser to build. There was something that you kind of hinted at a little bit earlier before is sort of the default behavior of being able to parse into these things and these various objects, right? Like there's a couple things that it attempts to use. So if there is a constructor that takes in a straight string, but also the type converter APIs. So if you're familiar with how those work in C# for effectively, like I know for me, I was used to them from WPF, right? I type some string in my XAML, and somehow that string in my XAML gets converted into real C# object somewhere, right? And that's all the type converter stuff. So any object that has a type converter on it that converts from a string will also just work out of the box, right? So, or if you have some type and you want to specify a type converter for it, that'll just magically work out the gate, and away you go, right? So it's another way if you want to kind of inject yourself in the middle to do some fancy conversion stuff, right? If you roll your own logic in a type converter, that works as well. So just for what it's worth. I think I'm out of things to say. I didn't let you talk enough, John. My Mountain Dew is not even empty.
Oh, that's okay.
It's okay. It's getting close to empty.
I don't get paid by the word, so I think that's fine.
You get paid by the line of code, I'm sure of it, based on your contributions.
Well, I mean, this has been, like I said before, this has been kind of a side project. So this isn't the project that I get paid for, and on the, on my I call it my day job, which is .NET Interactive. I feel like I get paid to remove code.
That actually makes sense. I have a coworker who unfortunately couldn't make it tonight, but he did promise to watch the recording. When he came from his last job, his over/under on GitHub for their main repo, I forget exactly what the number was. I think it was a little over 1 million. But he had removed more lines of code, or he had done more removals than adds, according to the Git stats.
That's fantastic.
It's like, especially over that long of a period to finally have it. Now, obviously, there was a couple like major refactors in that where it was, I'm the guy who gets to delete the 20,000 line file.
Mm-hmm.
That helps skew the numbers a little bit, but still pretty fun when you get to delete it. So short version, I add the code, John deletes it.
I delete code for several other people as well.
Excellent. So his over-under is quite low. And I'll volunteer John as well. If people have any questions on .NET Interactive or these wonderful notebooks that have been totally awesome. I used to be a big fan of try.net as my go-to area for, hey, I just want to try out this little bit of C# code, right? Let's drop in a snippet here and see what happens. And these notebooks have been, I think it's actually quicker for me to get a notebook open than to open up the try.net website now, which is pretty cool. Part of it comes from the fact that usually VS Code is already sitting there open, and it's like, new notebook, let's run some code and have some fun, which makes it totally awesome. So I don't know if people don't have any more questions. Nicole, what do we do? I'm not used to ending early. I'm used to getting yelled at.
I can still yell at you if you need me to. Kevin, why do you have 7 minutes left? Come on.
Excellent. Okay, John. Since nobody's asking questions, I'm gonna do this. So if you were to do knowledge, this is the one that I discovered earlier from milliseconds, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, and then if we were to pass it a format specifier of, right, what does that output? So for reference, the F specifier is the millisecond part of the time span. Do you know what this outputs? Hint, it surprised me, so it's not the obvious 0, 0,
Yeah,
0.
I'm trying to figure out what would be the surprising output of this. No, I don't know what it outputs.
Oh, hey. What? Okay, now I'm confused because that's not what it does on the command line.
Oh dear.
I wonder if it changed. So the docs for it call out that the time spans are only the from seconds and from milliseconds overloads are only accurate down to the millisecond. And so due to rounding, they will round down. Well, in this case, round down because 0.1 is closer to 0 than 1, right? Rather than round up. So the fact that this outputs this, now I'm just surprised. Dang it, now I got to go figure out when it changed. This feels like one of those things with all of the .NET 5 numeric improvement stuff that may have gotten improved.
Yeah, it's possible.
Which means now that there might be a pull request for a docs page that might need to happen.
As long as -0 still works, then you know all of my code will still work.
For anybody who hasn't seen it, the -0 double, there is a lot of some really fun bugs that come from finding where that's totally legit, and there are technically 2 zeros. Just doesn't get visually represented differently. Well, cool. I guess, Nicole, I can go ahead and kill the recording. Thank you, John, for coming and joining me on this. This was much more fun to do with you than to just let me prattle on for a little bit, showing off your work. It's much better to give you the applause.
I'm the chief cat herder in some ways too. There's really been a huge number of people's effort has gone into this, and Kathleen, in particular, has really given focus to the project over time and kind of kicked it off. Like it wouldn't have happened if she hadn't said, "Hey, we need a better parser." Right? We built one, but she kind of channeled it and helped pull the community together. She introduced Mark and I to one another. So a big shout out to her as well.
Yeah. And I will say she's definitely been instrumental in making sure that like those hackathons that Mark mentioned earlier about getting people together to work on it. There's a substantial number of people from Intelitech and Microsoft who have come in and helped out on this over time. So you can see the vast majority of them are listed as contributors here. I say vast majority because I know that there are some people who are not on this list. Simply because of like when we did pairing at hackathons, not everybody might have been the person submitting effort into this. But yeah, if you are interested, you could see it here and everybody that went in there. So
yeah, and more contributions are always welcome. There's issues that are marked with help wanted and good first issue.
Yeah.
If you're looking for something to dig into.
Yep. And if you are interested in tracking on what is, so yeah, the help wanted and good first issue, you'll note there's at least a couple good first issues out there. So if you want to snag one of them, you're welcome to do it. And if you're just interested in, hey, you guys said it was going to go GA, when is that going to happen? When this little green bar gets to this side.
Yeah.
Give or take a little bit. So, but if people are interested in following along, I know there's been a bunch of work to try and kind of hash out some of these issues, or even if people just want to provide feedback, like we said before, especially on like that console in one of trying to make sure that the shape of that API is correct, is somewhat difficult. And so having some feedback on what that is, or even just making sure that there's no use cases that we're missing, where, hey, I really want to do X type thing. Getting that kind of information is always valuable as well. So not all contributions necessarily need to be code related. I also know that there was, for a while, people were going through and just adding like XML docs to it. Yep. and helping out a great deal for that. So,
and there's a lot of that one left to be done as well. It's a great way to learn the API, and it's also a great way to give us feedback, because if you don't know the API very well and you have to write documentation for it, it forces you to dig into it and ask questions that people like Kevin and I, who have been working on this for so long, we don't ask ourselves those questions anymore. It's just obvious that output has 3 T's in it. We don't even see it. So, that's a great way to use what someone described recently as your expertise as a novice.
Yes, that is actually a good point. That is something that John and I will never be able to provide to the project, is that expertise. And unfortunately, if you start helping out, eventually you won't be able to provide it either. But the other thing too is, if you want any follow-up, there is a Gitter chat room as well, monitored by at least John and I and several others as well. So if you start digging in, you have questions, you want feedback, if the circle on the issue chat isn't sufficient and you're looking for just something quick and immediate, you can always post something there. And we try to keep an eye on it. Any closing words, John?
No, I don't think so. I think we've said it all in exactly the amount of time allotted.
Yes.
Yeah, you guys did a great job. We have about 30 seconds left. So I'm going to go ahead and say thank you to everyone for coming. And the link is in the chat if you'd like to go ahead and sign up for next month's meetup.
Perfect.